Oil companies had a fascinating response to President Donald Trump, who asked executives in said oil companies if they have any interest in returning to Venezuela.
All right, folks, gather round. Today we're diving headfirst into a classic tale of geopolitical intrigue, corporate greed, and of course, the ever-present shadow of American interventionism. We're talking Venezuela, baby. The official narrative is always so neat, isn't it? Democracy, human rights, and maybe a dash of fighting communism a little bit. But what if the real story is messier, more self-serving, and involves powerful players pulling strings behind the curtain? We're going to break down this clip, expose the flimsy excuses, and get to the bottom of why Uncle Sam really might be eyeing Caracas. Get ready to have your mind blown, or at least mildly annoyed by the hypocrisy. Let's get at it.
Once Nicolas Maduro is ousted in a regime change war. And so far, the answer is a hard no. That's what Politico is reporting, and I am super shocked by that. Cenk, what are your 2 cents?
Wow, this is rich, isn't it? The shock in their voice is almost palpable. A hard no? From oil companies? It's like finding out your local bar doesn't want to serve cheap beer anymore. You're left scratching your head because everything you thought you knew about the world, about American policy, about the very essence of capitalism, just got a tiny little wrinkle. For decades, the playbook has been simple. Country has oil. Country is unstable or anti-American. America helps with regime change. American oil companies swoop in like vultures at a buffet. It's practically a geopolitical Mad Libs. We need to bring democracy to resource-rich nations because leaders we don't like is a dictator. And incidentally, our oil companies could really use some new drilling rights. But now, even the oil companies are like, nah, we're good. And why? Because the market's flooded, prices are low, and investing in a country we systematically destabilize for years is, shocker, a risky adventure. It's almost comical how quickly the profit motive moves and can be override by the patriotic fever when the numbers don't add up. It really begs the question, if it's not about the oil anymore, then what is it about? Because you know darn well, they're not just doing it for the Venezuelan people.
Yeah, it's definitely surprising because Venezuela appeared to be picked first because it has the largest oil reserve in the world, and we almost always attack countries with large oil reserves. But I think that I have a different theory on why we're going there, and it might surprise you. So let's find out why it might not be the oil companies, and then talk about why we might be going to war with Venezuela anyway.
So the answer that Trump received, which I'm sure he didn't like, from these oil industry executives, is likely due to the current oil markets, right? The fact that the oil supply has been increased, which means more supply, prices come down. So the US benchmark oil price was around $56 a barrel as of Wednesday afternoon. And that's actually the lowest it's been since January of 2021. Here in California, we're not feeling the relief because they tax the crap out of gas here, and we're still paying like at least 4.50 a gallon if you're lucky. But anyway, this has given Trump some wiggle room to attack Venezuela without um, too much concern about oil prices being impacted to a point where things are unaffordable. So he's like, all right, I got some wiggle room. But the increased supply is also having the opposite effect on these oil companies. Those prices are also way too low to entice companies to take the risk of pouring huge investments into the crumbling Venezuelan oil facilities that former strongman Hugo Chavez seized decades ago, industry officials and analysts said. And I want to just quickly correct something that I said on the show yesterday. Trump said something about how Venezuela stole our oil. And I'm like, What? What does he even mean by that? I think he's referring to what Chavez had done under his leadership. And so US oil companies have better investment options elsewhere, according to one person who's familiar with the discussions. And then two people familiar with Trump's efforts say that the administration has only recently started initiating the outreach to the industry. It's not as straightforward to convince companies to risk capital in an uncertain political environment, one of those people said. Now, I've got more details on Trump's conversations with these oil executives. So, for instance, Evanon Romero, who is a former executive at the Venezuelan state-owned oil company known as Petróleos de Venezuela, now works as a consultant in Houston and is actually part of this opposition effort against Maduro, right? So in late November, the Trump administration met with Exxon, ConocoPhillips, and representatives of the Venezuelan opposition group to which Romero belongs, although he wasn't at this particular meeting. The meeting was led by the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, and the discussion centered on the possibility of the two oil majors returning to Venezuela, right? Now, Romero said Exxon and ConocoPhillips aired concerns about the debt they are owed from their past Venezuela operations. And the Venezuela representatives floated the opportunity to take control of additional fields to compensate for the debt. So, what does that mean? So, US oil companies were actually operating in Venezuela. Chevron still does. Chevron has some sort of deal with Venezuela, and apparently they're happy with it. It's working out for them. But other oil companies were also operating out of Venezuela previously. This is like in the early 2000s when Hugo Chavez suddenly decided to force them to give majority stakes of their projects to the Petróleos de Venezuela, to the state essentially. He wanted to nationalize the oil. So Venezuela ended up seizing the assets of companies that resisted, and that's the debt that these oil companies are referring to. Now again, Chevron has been the sole major oil company to continue working in Venezuela, operating under a special license to produce oil in the country and then export it to the United States. But Romero said that Wright, again, Wright's the energy secretary, encouraged the companies, quote, to get an understanding and solve their outstanding problems along the way, end quote, but made clear, this is an important part of the story, made clear the Trump administration would like to see more Venezuelan crude flowing to US refineries. I thought that was an interesting part of the story because Trump very recently trashed the oil in Venezuela. It's like, it's nasty oil. We don't want that oil. It's like, is it though? Finally, Romero says, we need those barrels. That's an important message from the government. So,
Yeah. So a couple thoughts on this. So first off, the oil companies oftentimes get outrageous deals with these countries. Why? Because they threaten to have America invade them if they don't. So that has a long history. In the 1950s, we deposed the leader of Iran because he wanted the Iranian people to have a larger share of the oil profits. And so the oil companies forced Britain and America to get rid of them, and that's what eventually led to the Ayatollah. So it's possible that Hugo Chavez was saying, yeah, but it's our oil, and we're paying you way too much, and the Venezuelan people should keep more of it. Now, if they had a previous deal and they should honor that deal, okay, fine, right? But in terms of a country deciding what to do with its own natural resources, that's not theft. No, you
right.
taking their natural resources at the point of a gun at lower prices is theft.
Chef's kiss right there. That's the truth bomb we needed. That's not theft. No. You take their natural resources at the point of a gun at lower prices is theft. Let's not engrave that on a plaque and hang it in the State Department, shall we? It's mind-boggling how often we see countries asserting sovereignty over their own natural resources, only to have it framed by Western media and politicians as some act of grand larceny. Imagine if your neighbor came over, admired your apple tree, and then decided, you know what? These apples are our apples now. You can have a few, but we're taking the majority. And if you object, well, we might just call in the military to restore order to your orchard. You'd call the police, not cheer them on for liberating your fruit. This isn't just about Venezuela or Chavez. This is the historical pattern of colonialism and neocolonialism. Resource rich nations are consistently told they don't have the right to control their own wealth if it interferes with the profits of multinational corporations. It's economic bullying, plain and simple, dressed up in the fancy clothes of international law or free markets. Let's be clear. The nation decided to use its own resources for its own people, even if it means renegotiating old exploitative deals, is not theft. It's self determination. And that's something we should actually respect, not bomb.
So I got no love for Hugo Chavez, but that is very far from theft when you actually control your own natural resources. In terms of the oil companies, they've got two different conflicting things here. One is sometimes oil prices are so low that it's not worth drilling anywhere, let alone riskier places, right? And risk could be for a number of different reasons, including what type of oil it is, and that makes it more expensive to drill in those places, right? And but when you start a war with a oil-rich country, usually because of that instability, oil prices go up. So I'm still surprised that they wouldn't want it. But apparently, if this story is to be believed, and I can see why they wouldn't, right? For the reasons that I just gave you, there are many circumstances in which it might not be profitable for them.
Right.
Well, then we've got to pick a new reason why we're going to war with Venezuela.
Right. And, I genuinely do think that for someone like Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, it's deeply ideological. Um, and, Cubans are not organized the way Zionists are. So, but honestly, the Cuban refugees who came here in the late 50s are just as zealous as the Zionists are about their own political project.
Whoa, hold up. The comparison is bold, but it hits a nerve because it highlights a deeply uncomfortable truth about the outsized influence of certain lobby groups in American foreign policy. When you have a powerful, organized diaspora pushing a very specific, often hardline agenda against a foreign government, it can warp our entire approach to that region. It's not anti Cuban to question whether US policy should be dictated by a vocal minority who left Cuba decades ago, just as it's not anti Jew to question the influence of the pro Israel lobby on Middle East policy. These are legitimate discussions about who truly benefits from US intervention and whose interests are actually being served. Are we really going to drag America into another quagmire, another regime change operation, all to settle old scores and satisfy ideological crusades? The idea that we should topple the Venezuelan government to eventually get the Cuban government is a geopolitical Rube Goldberg machine of bad ideas. It's a domino theory that always ends in human suffering, regional instability, and zero actually benefit from the average American. We need to be critical of these narratives, regardless of who pushes them, because history has shown us time and time again that these ideological projects rarely end well for anyone but the defense contractors and the ideologues themselves. We need to look at the bigger picture.
So I do think it's ideological for Marco Rubio and for Trump. Obviously, he personally is motivated by the oil, but I don't begrudge the oil executives for actually being smart and remembering, hey, Venezuela burned us before. Are we really going to take that risk again? So we'll see how this plays out. But I am curious if these meetings and these discussions maybe motivated Trump to avoid talking about going to war with Venezuela during his address to the nation.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, Anna. From my point of view, look, normally this would be mainly about the oil. Now this is the second big clue we've had that it might not be in this case. We shared a previous story before about it as well. And it's usually a confluence of factors that leads to a dramatically wrong decision like this. And defense contractors always get rich from war, of course. Israel apparently has an interest in this because they claim Venezuela and Hezbollah and Hamas are working on drones together, so they want them destroyed and smashed to pieces. Is that a large factor? Probably, just because of the overwhelming power they have. But my best guess is this is driven by Rubio. Um,
Yeah.
and and you're right, Anna. If there's any second group in the country that's as zealous as the pro-Israel folks, it's the Cubans,
Yeah.
and you can't talk them out of it, and anything but annihilating the Cuban government is unacceptable to them. Anything other than that, right?
And I
So
disagree with them wholeheartedly on this. I don't think that the US should be dragged into a war with Venezuela in order to eventually lead to the toppling of, the communist regime in Cuba. I think that's ridiculous. It doesn't mean I hate Cubans. In fact, I have quite a lot of admiration for Cubans. So just keep that in mind. Yeah.
yeah, and it's so easy, right? Anna's husband's Cuban, and we all have Cuban friends. Who would hate Cubans? What a weird thing to be, right? But does that mean we have to agree with them that we need to go topple the Venezuelan government so we can topple the Cuban government? And if we don't agree, are we anti-Cuban? No, of course not. The only
Right.
ones who use that trick are the Israelis.
So there you have it, folks. From oil companies saying no thanks, to the historical content of theft, and finally to the powerful, often unseen hands of ideological lobbyists, and the story of US intervention in Venezuela, which is far more complex and frankly more cynical than what you've heard on the cable news so far. So tell me, what do you think? Is it all about oil, or the ideological aspect behind it, or just good old-fashioned American exceptionalism gone wild? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for some more straight talk, and hit that notification button so you don't miss our next deep dive into political, neopolitical shaping the world. Stay informed, stay critical, and keep fighting for a better future.